to welcome this August gathering for the NDRG special annual lecture that we are having today. And as we are honored, we are extremely honored to have with us in the special annual lecture renowned scholar and researcher who is also has done a lot of work in the space of crisis management, Professor Arnold Howitt from the Kennedy School of Governance, Harvard University. Professor lecture will be, and this Professor Arnold's lecture, this lecture will be chaired by Shri Kunal Satyarthi, who is the advisor policy and planning, National Disaster Management Society Authority, Government of India. We are also honored to have with us Dr. Nivedita Haran, retired IS and governing board member of the, who will be giving her special comments on this. As a brief introduction to our speakers, just to briefly introduce them, Shri Kunal Satyarthi has been a member, has been a member of Indian Forest Service, has been part since 1997 batch from Himachal Pradesh cadre. Presently, he has been appointed as advisor policy and planning National Disaster Management Group. He has more than 20 years of experience in imparting training in forest laws, policy, environment policy, and has also got a lot of practical field experience in dealing with natural resource management. And he has also worked widely and extensively as in the Biodiversity Board, Climate Change Center, Space Application Center, State Wetland Development Authority, Patent Center, and in science popularization in Himachal Pradesh. Academically, he is a master. He has a master and an MPhil in botany from the University of Delhi, and a master in public policy from Australia National University, Canberra. Briefly, to introduce our speaker, Professor Arnold. Professor Arnold needs no introduction to this room, but I just take this to tell what Professor Arnold has been doing. Professor Arnold is founding faculty and co-director of the program on crisis leadership and senior advisor of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovations, both at John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. He has worked extensively on emergency preparedness and crisis management issues, both in the United States and in Asia. Among his most important writing, you can see Dr. Howitt has co-authored and edited public health preparedness, case studies in policy management, natural disaster management in Asia Pacific, managing crisis, responding to large-scale emergencies, and countering terrorism. Dr. Howitt received his bachelor's degree from Columbia University and master's and PhD degree in political science from Harvard University. He has been a faculty and member administrator at Harvard since 1976. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nivedita Haran. Dr. Nivedita Haran joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1980 and worked in the state of Kerala and in Government of India in various departments that include Department of Land Revenue, Disaster Management, Agriculture, Industries, Labor and Employment, Planning and Home. Apart from serving as district collector in her capacities, she was director and later joint secretary in the Ministry of Urban Development, Government of India. She was on deputation to the United Peacekeeping Mission in Kosovo for 5 years. Post-retirement, she has been engaged in activities related to research and academics in areas of disaster resilience building, good governance, digitization of land reforms, labor and migration issues, and management of water, wastewater, and solid waste management. It has been my pleasure and honor to be able to read out these the speakers of this in this meeting, and as we are all here to listen to what crisis management in a post-pandemic world is going to be like. Crisis big and small pepper our lives, and crisis and leadership has always been looked at. Dealing with leadership in normal times is something that has been looked at, but crisis leadership when applied to unusual situations and stressful conditions is something that we all need to understand, particularly now when we are faced with in the post-pandemic and post-COVID world. And in that space, this is a very important discussion, and I'm really honored and have the pleasure to welcome our guest speakers on this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Madhushree Shekhar, for your heartening welcome. As already mentioned by Professor Madhushree Shekhar from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, we wholeheartedly welcome you all to NDRG Special Annual Lecture on Crisis Leadership in the Pandemic World. And we start.
Why?
It is Minister Udaya Kamal. Yes. All right.
But then he was like also. Well, anyway,
I think you can mute yourself, please.
Kindly, please mute yourself. So as already mentioned by Professor Madhushree Shekhar from TIS, we wholeheartedly welcome you all to NDRG Special Annual Lecture on Crisis Leadership in the Post-Pandemic World. And we start it by handing it over to a very learned and very experienced All India Services Forest Officer, Shri Kunal Satyarthi ji, who is currently the advisor to the National Disaster Management Authority, Government of India. With great honor, we request him to chair today's session, and he is requested to then invite Professor Arnold Howitt. Over to you, Kunal sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Garika, and Professor Arnold Howitt. The great reading of your CV reflects that I should speak less and listen more, and I should be more a learner with the kind of work that you've done and the kind of academic background that you've taken in. I feel belittled by your presence, but welcome to this forum, Dr. Nivedita Haran ma'am, Amita Singh ma'am, Gaurika, and Professor Madhushree for this great introduction that I don't deserve, but has been given this opportunity to address this group of participants. I am new to this field of disaster, but I'll just share my thoughts on this before moving on. And I was hearing the conversation between Guma Sahab, Tripathi ji, and Nina ma'am. So I know people know each other in this portfolio a lot. All of you are known to each other. So having said that, I think this is a very interesting topic. I was thinking about this topic through all the meetings of maze of meetings that we do in this organization. So the day I was thinking about this topic, and I was talking to my colleagues in the NDMA, and I was trying to look at the words in this topic, and it is calling out crisis leadership. So I'll be confining myself to a general layman perspective on this whole issue and leave the intricacies to our learned speaker, Professor Arnold. But I think the world is not going to be the same, and we have seen the leadership dismantle and leadership rebuild and leadership evolving in the last 2 years, and everything has evolved, including we meeting on this platform. It would have been difficult to hear to Professor Arnold until unless this pandemic had happened. So this webinar that we're doing with 100 or 1,000 is a possibility that we did not explore. It was available to us, but we did not explore in the pre-pandemic times. So the world has actually changed forever, and I think those changes are very important to encapsulate and capture and move on in life. So I think particularly during the pandemic time, because I have seen this happen, unfurl this. Everybody on this forum, whether on this platform or on the live streaming, has seen this pandemic affect them in whatever denominations it did, and there's nobody who's escaped this pandemic. That is first thing. And then we have seen all those turmoils of the social crisis that this pandemic brought in, the economic crisis that this pandemic brought in, and the resurgence that the world has seen. I'm just back from Glasgow from the COP26, and the world looks so normal in Glasgow in spite of all the precautions that the COP26 was taking for that. But everybody now realized, particularly borrowing from that pandemics are going to be much more frequent. Climate change is going to have various kind of impacts on all kind of disasters possible. And there's a new urge in the global forum to look at the slightly backseated or forgotten concepts of the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damages. It is revived back in this COP26 now. There's also the Nairobi Work Program. Then we are also looking now very seriously at national adaptation plans. There are only currently till this COP, only 32 countries have a national adaptation plan of any dimension, and only 8 submitted a plan this time. So currently the world has 30 countries which have a national adaptation plan. An adaptation plan for climate change would now be adaptation plan not only for livelihoods but also for pandemics. So the world has to understand that we need to adapt to this phenomena of climate change vis-a-vis pandemic, and also adapt in various other portfolios. So it could be adaptation for fishermen, adaptation for agriculturists, adaptation for horticulture. Adaptation has to happen on all frontiers, and that has become very important. That drew the attention of the COP for a pretty long time. I was negotiating for India on the National Adaptation Plan, and also on the Nairobi Work Program, and also on the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. So it is very true that these are very intricately linked, and these are going to be much more repetitive than what we have seen now. And the impacts on social structures has been phenomenal, and the impacts on economics has been phenomenal. And I think the world leaders that I saw in this COP, the whole world descended on that. And they were more talking about the pandemic all the time, although it was a conference on climate change, but pandemic did not evade the importance that it brought to the CCC, the climate change conference. But we're also realistic that there are new risks that are going to waiting to happen. We are currently going through a pandemic phase. Currently, this country particularly seems quite happy. Of the third wave not appearing. We keep having all these disaster management meetings, and we have this caution that this is still not over, and we should be prepared for that. And we were caught slightly ill-prepared to the magnitude of the second wave that happened in this country. So we always, when the pandemic started during the first wave, I was a faculty member. I was heading the Forest Academy at Dehradun, and at that time we used to look at all those graphs of Spanish flu, and there would be waves and all that. But that is all looks like ancient India. If you look at those Spanish flu graphs today, after 1.5 years of the knowledge and the database that has been generated about this pandemic, those comparisons to Spanish flu look like very rudimentary, as if that happened in some prehistoric time, because this current pandemic has behaved very, very aberrantly and has affected different countries differently, has not followed a particular trend, although it goes by the dynamics of the RNA and DNA to follow a particular trend, but it has shown such abnormal graphs. And I keep looking at this graph. I get a graph every day of all the districts and all the states in the country. We can't make any assumptions on that. I will not share that, but we have 38 districts in the country which show a very aberrant way of high positivity rates for reasons unknown. They did not celebrate Diwali. They had no great congregation, and still the graphs are quite high in very, very remote areas of this country. I'll not name the states and the district, but it is a reality, and therefore we are seized with the matter, and it doesn't look to be comparing to anything that happened in the past, and that is very important to understand. I think this I was reading a book which says that this world actually belongs to microbes and viruses and fungi for pretty long millions of years. This world is owned by small RNAs, not to scare the audience, but that is what a book talks about. And I think that is coming true, because the most successful species called Homo sapiens with the great 23 pair of chromosomes is threatened by a small segment, if you are students of biology, by a small segment of an RNA. We used to think we have the best machines. After scientific revolution and industrial revolution, we have conquered nature, we have conquered the world, and we can determine how things behave in this world, how animals behave, how birds behave, how the weather pattern behave. We can predict that, we can study that, we can find remedy for that. But that doesn't look like a reality. Sitting in Delhi, this is my first posting in this part of the world. Sitting in Delhi, it looks like an unrealistic assumption to take nature for granted. to take environment for granted, for sure. And that I say from all disaster perspective. I'm doing a project on glacial lake outflows. I was talking to counterparts in the Italian Alps and the Andes, and all of them have the same problem. All of them, pandemic is one reality, but I think leadership would be in crisis for all these disasters. And we are not prepared for that. And we are not prepared as leaders, because leaders also struggle for resources during those periods of pandemic. I'll quote that off my sleeves, because during those days of the second wave in this country, most of the leaders and most of the people who mattered or who had access to resources were busy looking at those resources for their own requirements or for their own family members or relatives, and it was a scarce resource. Scarcity is so important in pandemic times, and leadership to resolve to that phenomena becomes very, very tricky. So crisis leadership would be a new phenomena to look into, and to look at how leaders would be behaving in such situations. I think the digital platform, whether you're a leader of any denomination, digital platform has become so important. You have to register on a particular app to get a data about what happens near you and who is the nearest COVID pandemic near you. So I think the technology and the sector-specific challenges that this pandemic has posed will take some time to settle down. It is a havoc in the world right now. The dust is still settling down. I don't know settling or unsettling, but it will take different shapes. Like training programs or awareness programs would be. I had a visit to the National Institute of Disaster Management in the morning, and I had a half day spent there. And I was telling them that training programs and awareness programs would be totally offline and online version. In offline versions, we can get the best speakers, a large number of participants. Training programs would be particularly driven towards the digital platform of the webinar and all that. So, and the offline world will become, meetings would be mostly done on digital mode now onwards. So things would change, and things would change for, I presume it will change for good, but the important thing is when the whole thing happened, people read a document called the Epidemiology Act of 1886. We struggled for statutes in this country. We struggled for statutes. I was in a campus, beautiful campus, and there was three probationers who came from, forest probationers who came from Spain and developed the first symptoms in the whole town and the whole state. So I'm witness to the first corona pandemic thing arriving in a campus, and I've seen leadership shaped differently, and people came and locked the gates, and the whole campus was closed. Nobody was sure as to what is going to happen. Nobody was sure about what kind of leadership is required, and people resorted to a 1800 act drafted by during the British time, saying the Epidemiology Act, and used certain powers to keep people away from people who are infected. So keeping people enclosed is a new phenomena we have seen in a pandemic situation. Whether you keep people enclosed in a room in a house, or whether you keep an apartment enclosed, or whether you keep a whole area enclosed, or the whole city is put behind walls. This is a new phenomenon. Humans can become, I casually used to say, humans don't like humans during pandemic. One species of the same kind don't like this other species, and particularly if you are anyway related to somebody who is carrying this pandemic, you are almost like that is the only way you can control this pandemic, and that we realized in the Epidemiology Act and the Disaster Management Act of 2005 bailed us out, because it actually bailed us out in those times. We were not prepared to take on this challenge statutorily in this country, and the DMA Act came for the rescue and had the clauses, and then the phenomena of ex gratia payments and all that. So having said that, I think this is going to be a very interesting thing to listen to. I would like to make it more grounded, because I have seen, I could quote examples of district magistrates behaving aberrantly, and the local legislators and parliamentarians and ministers, all the people in authority. If you're down with COVID, you're down with COVID. You might be the secretary of the National Disaster Management Authority or the State Disaster Management Authority. But then in those crisis situations, and we have borrowed that. And I was listening to this word today in one of the meetings, we should have a lockdown in Delhi. And lockdown is a word that we invented. It is not statutorily provided. And everybody is looking forward, kab lockdown hoga, and so on and so forth. So I think that is so important to understand. These are new terms. Social distancing is a term that I used to initially think in 2 years before that it talks about something else. It has some social connotation. It takes actually physical distancing, 6 meter apart, masking, social distancing. New words have been innovated, and my only last remarks would be that we would require a different set of leaders who are able to guide and were able to play the role of facilitators and do the helping that is required, or whatever leadership you have at the grassroots level or the topmost level. But the leadership has to evolve to encompass such great uncertainties and plan for the safety and the growth of the people. And it is always a dilemma between economics, and I find this dilemma very interesting. When to open because economy is suffering, and when not to open because then human beings are dying. So we're actually trading off between money and human life is what clearly it is. How much we can kill and how much economy we can drive. So that is the reality of this pandemic, and that reality is to sink in, and that reality has to guide future programs, and we are working on a lot of them. I'm not talking currently on behalf of the National Disaster Management Authority, but we are having a lot of thoughts on that. But interesting topic, and thanks to the organizers for giving this opportunity to share my perspective on this issue, layman's perspective. But I thought it is important to share all this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kunal sir, for igniting the discussion on pandemic and raising some of the very pertinent issues related to COVID-19 pandemic. May I now request Professor Arnold Howard, Founding Faculty Co-Director, Program on Crisis Leadership, Harvard Kennedy School, a very learned and experienced professor whose research spans from Oriental to the Occidental world. I hand over the virtual stage to you, Professor Arnold, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, sir, for so thoughtfully setting up the topic of crisis leadership in our world today. I am extremely honored to have been asked to give this lecture, and I'm very pleased to be having the opportunity to speak with so many experienced professionals and academics who study the topic of emergency management and disaster response. It's also a pleasure to look out in the audience and see some old friends who are here, and also to feel regret that we can't all be gathering in person and have the opportunity, give me the opportunity to meet so many other people with whom I share interests. My topic today is what crisis leadership is going to look like. What are some of the challenges of leadership in the post-COVID-19 era? And I'd like to start by putting the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of other crises that are confronting society today, but then step back and think conceptually about how COVID is an example of what I would like to call a true crisis, namely one that is characterized by the defining feature of that category, and that is the presence of substantial novelty. And I'll explain that term more as we go along. And then finally, in closing, I'd like to examine what the COVID crisis and other trends suggest about preparing for the crises and disasters of the future. So let me begin by looking at the very briefly at where we are with COVID-19 cases worldwide and the death rate. As we all know, this has been a horrendous experience, not only from a worldwide perspective or from the perspective of our respective countries, but also for our families and our daily lives, and the disruption that we've all experienced in the ways that we might have preferred to be conducting our affairs. As you can see from this graph and the table, the world has seen at least 250 million cases of COVID-19 since the beginning of the epidemic in roughly December of 2019, and at least 5 million people worldwide have perished from this terrible disease. That's almost certainly an underestimate because some of the reporting of both cases and deaths has been insufficient to capture the full scale of the epidemic. There have been many variations over time in the way that the epidemic has reflected itself in the world. This graph shows a number of different regions of the world. As you can see, the dark blue line represents the Asia Pacific. Unfortunately, the curve is going down. By contrast, the bright red line represents the United States and Canada, which has had some of the worst, the United States in particular, some of the worst outbreaks. And our trend has been down, but looking up a little bit in the recent past. On a worldwide basis, right now, the hotspots of COVID in the world are in the United States, Russia, Mongolia, Afghanistan, and Chile, with lesser elements of the epidemic in a number of other places. And we've made enormous progress, but unfortunately not sufficient progress in getting people vaccinated. Now something over 50% of the world's population have received at least one dose of the vaccine. That means about 4.1 billion people worldwide. But we obviously have a long way to go in order to get the vaccination rate up to the point where the epidemic will be stemmed. And this map gives an idea of where the vaccination has been most heavily concentrated, and it is primarily in the large and or rich countries of the world, with much less attention to many of the poorer countries in the global south. So that very quick look at COVID indicates clearly that it's a crisis, which is certainly no surprise to any of us. But the world also faces other crises that are worth mentioning. We've seen phenomenal outbreaks of catastrophic wildfires in places as far separated as California, Turkey, Siberia, Greece, and a number of other places. These fires have raged out of control for weeks or even months, and they cover, many of them cover much larger areas than we are used to seeing in the wildfires that certainly have occurred before. But these outbreaks tend, in many places, have been bigger and more severe than they have been elsewhere. We have air pollution problems around the world, not least in India, and Delhi right at this moment is experiencing a horrible air pollution crisis. There has been severe flooding around the world, again, in places as far apart as India, China, Germany, and Belgium. Just a year ago, there was a horrendous explosion of hazardous chemicals in the port of Beirut that destroyed the port itself and residential and commercial areas surrounding that part of Beirut. And overall, this has been a terrible blow to the economy of Lebanon, which was in precarious shape because of the epidemic as well already. When we speak about crises, there really are a number of different categories that we could look at, as my examples have perhaps indicated already. Obviously, there are public health crises of infectious disease, like the ones that we've seen, particularly over the last 2 decades. There are natural disasters that your group has been very concerned with, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods. We certainly are increasingly concerned with technology, infrastructure, and systems failures, ranging from industrial disasters, transportation accidents, and various forms of cyber attack. terrorism and civil disorder plague a number of places. And as my colleague who introduced me spoke about, chronic or long-term emergencies, many of them stemming from climate change and including things like drought and famine and the civil strife that is increasingly causing in places that are struggling with the effects of these long-term emergencies. So I'd like to step back from all of these examples and ask, what are the defining characteristics of a crisis? We use that word colloquially, but what does it actually mean? What is a way of distinguishing it from what we might call routine emergencies? Is there something fundamentally different, or is it simply big rather than smaller? And why do I dwell on this? What difference does it make if we try to differentiate crises from routine emergencies? So let me think about that in terms of a continuum of situations that we might find if we were magistrates or other kinds of public managers. Under normal conditions, we pick up garbage, we operate transportation systems, buses or subways. Sometimes we encounter minor operating problems. We may have a highway tie-up. We may have a failure of a subway train to operate effectively. But these are things that the agencies and organizations that operate these facilities are able to overcome relatively quickly. But then we move into the world of emergencies. And I'd like to look first at what I would term routine emergencies and try to distinguish these as a particular category of the kinds of things that we worry about. A routine emergency is sudden and typical and certainly unplanned. It may have high stakes, lives may be at risk, or there may be property in danger. There's a degree of urgency to it, sometimes high degrees of urgencies, and the outcomes are contingent. They're going to vary depending on how well we've planned, what kinds of decisions we make in the midst of these emergencies, and what sorts of actions we take in order to deal with them. But I think the major thing that distinguishes what I've called routine emergencies is the fact that we can anticipate this type of emergency in terms of general characteristics, even if we can't tell when it's going to happen or exactly where it's going to happen. But we have seen these kinds of things before, and therefore we can anticipate their characteristics. So think about this as something that is separate from the size of the emergency. On the one hand, we might have a relatively small traffic accident on a highway, and we can see a number of emergency vehicles here: a tow truck, a police car, a fire engine, an emergency medical ambulance, and we can see the traffic being tied up. But these are familiar kinds of situations in any big city around the world, and they can usually be dealt with relatively quickly. Injured people are taken away from the scene, damaged vehicles are towed away, the police direct traffic. In case one of the vehicles bursts into flames, we have a fire truck present. Public works people arrive and they put any physical features back in order, and within a relatively short time, traffic can flow. On the other hand, the huge fire in a wildland situation that's depicted in the photograph on the right may last for days or weeks, or if it's a very large one, it could last for months. But what counts in the terminology that I'd like to use today, what makes them routine emergencies, is that emergency responders and the organizations that support them can forecast these kinds of accidents by type. They can get ready for them. They can train their people. They can buy equipment. They can practice. They can do all sorts of preparation And because this kind of emergency repeats itself, sometimes on a daily basis or a weekly basis, or perhaps in an annual cycle, this is true for forest fires, the responders gain experience in dealing with these kinds of things in the repeated instances, and they gain expertise in how to deal with those things. So if we think about these sorts of emergencies, we can ask the question of what constitutes excellence in getting ready for routine emergencies. Well, on the preparedness side, quite obviously, we want a robust set of contingency plans that help us figure out what we would do. We want clarity of goals and priorities. So for example, if you're in the firefighting business, firefighters are very clear about what their goals and priorities are in dealing with fires. They know, first of all, that they are trying to save lives. Secondly, and only after they've saved as many lives as possible, they will try to protect property, but they will do this without creating extremely high risk of injury or death of the firefighters themselves. And so there's considerable clarity about what goals they're trying to achieve and what constraints those create. For preparedness for routine emergencies, excellent preparedness also puts in place the resources we need, the money, the people, the equipment, and we have, as a last characteristic, organization that can be effective in dealing with these kinds of emergencies. So if we think about this particularly in the people dimension, preparedness, first of all, tries to recruit and select the people that we put in these positions because of their basic capabilities that make them appear to be good candidates for these jobs. We give them basic training. We provide a number of different ways that they can develop skills. We conduct drills and exercises. And over time, these younger or newer people in the response professions gain real operational experience. And the result of this is that over time, these organizations develop expertise, that the people in the agencies become specialized, have skills, have experience that makes them effective. And the organization as a whole is experiencing learning. It is getting real world practice or real world operations that increase the effectiveness of these organizations. So excellence in preparing for these routine emergencies has a huge amount of preparation that goes into it, and particularly the development of our people to be capable of dealing with these sorts of emergencies. Excellence in preparing, though, for these routine emergencies, as important as it is not all of what emergency responders need to deal with. But it does constitute the vast majority of the things that those agencies deal with on a regular basis, perhaps as much as 95 or 98% of what they do, which is why it's so critical to develop those capabilities for routine emergencies. And nothing that I'll say today, when I start to focus on the crisis side of this ledger, it should diminish the importance of preparing for those routine emergencies along the lines that I've just described. But crises, I'd like to argue, create very different kinds of demands and require us to operate and to develop skills that differ in important ways from what we need to do in order to deal with routine emergencies. So the routine emergencies are highly important, but we need a different skill set and organizational capabilities for dealing with crises. So where do crises stand on this continuum that I've been developing? Many of the features of crises are similar to the features of a routine emergency. But what's critically different is, as I mentioned earlier, that there's significant elements of novelty in a crisis. that makes these fundamentally different from the routine emergencies that we deal with. And that novelty could arise in several different ways, at least three. One would be simply new under the sun, something that is an unprecedented challenge that we've never seen before, that responders have never encountered, and that throw up different challenges and different demands on those responders. And we don't have to look any further than the example that we've been facing over the last 2 years, an emergent infectious disease like COVID, something that the world had never seen before, that flummoxed us at the very beginning, where we've made some progress in devising both medical solutions for people who are afflicted with COVID, but even more importantly, developing vaccinations that can prevent people from contracting it. So one form of novelty is something that's brand new. But another form of novelty is something, and perhaps the most ordinary sort, is an emergency that's so much larger than what we've been prepared to handle. And again, the COVID experience gives us a very good example of that when we think about hospital overload under the press of COVID patients. And so in many countries around the world, we've seen the number of acutely ill people rising precipitously, descending on hospitals or seeking medical attention, and overloading the capacities of the people in the facilities that have to deal with them. That goes from being a routine emergency, namely someone who is critically ill. After all, our hospitals see those every single day and have considerable expertise in dealing with individuals with critical illnesses. But the overload that comes from the scale of the COVID epidemic and the extraordinary scale that this epidemic has created in terms of critically ill people have put hospitals under incredible strain. And the final way that we might see this see novelty is where a combination of emergencies occur roughly simultaneously or even exactly simultaneously that were never expected to occur together. And that might include something like typhoon evacuation that has to occur while COVID is rampant, and where one worries that individuals who have been moved into shelters, usually crowded into shelters, are going to be at risk of contracting COVID. Perhaps the paradigmatic example of this combination of emergencies would be the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident that occurred in Japan, in which one of the most highly prepared countries in the world experienced two things that they were somewhat prepared for, the earthquake and the tsunami. But the tsunami was so much larger than they expected that it caused immense damage and created a national crisis. And then on top of that, the nuclear accident. So these three ways, or at least three of the ways that novelty might arise and create a crisis, a brand new challenge, something of extraordinary size, or a combination of emergencies, each of which we might be prepared to deal with on a routine basis, but which we never expected to occur together, and therefore creates extra challenges and may even invalidate some of the things that we expected to do. Within this category of crises, we can distinguish, I think, two types of crises. One would be the sudden crisis, like the example that I gave, the 3/11 trio of crises in Japan, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident. Depicted here is the tsunami arriving on the coastline, and a fire that was generated by the earthquake disturbing an oil refinery on the outskirts of Tokyo. But we also have a second type of emergency, and that would be an emergent crisis. one that starts out perhaps even looking like a routine emergency, as COVID did, or SARS, in which the early practitioners who confronted cases of this thought that they were the sort of respiratory problems that appear every year, perhaps bad cases of flu, but over time, both SARS and on a much greater scale, COVID evolved in something quite different, and we realized that we were confronting something that we'd never seen before. So how do we think about putting these different types of situations into perspective? Well, this graph is meant to notionally illustrate on the x-axis the passage of time, and on the y-axis how severe these events are. And I talked about normal operations, which fluctuate a little bit with simple operating problems. When we have a routine emergency, whether it's a small or a large one, whether it's the traffic accident I illustrated or the forest fire, we have a burst of danger and perhaps severe consequences. But over time, our preparedness allows us to get in control of the situation and bring back normal circumstances. When crises strike, however, we have a different situation. The sudden crisis starts out as a severe event right from the beginning, an earthquake or a tornado or a typhoon, which is not exactly sudden, but where we have a relatively short period of time to get used to it. And the characteristic of this is that we usually recognize this as a crisis from the get-go, depending on its scale. Relatively high level leaders of our political jurisdictions, whether it's the senior leader in a state or the prime minister of a country, are engaged. The most senior emergency management officials are likely to be engaged. And rather than response building from the bottom up, we have both a bottom up and a top down response building simultaneously. Perhaps even tougher to deal with, though, are the emergent crises, which, as this yellow line depicts, start out looking a lot like a routine emergency. People with respiratory ailments begin to show up in hospitals, as occurred in Wuhan, China, when COVID began to emerge. But at some point, there is a break in the pattern, and we realize that we should realize that this is not a routine emergency, but rather something that is spiking to become an emergent crisis over time. We could think not only about the COVID epidemic or various kinds of emergent infectious disease, but climate change, or some of the consequences of climate change, like drought or famine, as being slow developing crises that may not be recognized as that at the beginning, but develop over time into something that becomes incredibly compelling and incredibly challenging. So crises, as I've tried to argue, are quite different from routine emergencies. They have some of the initial characteristics of it, but they're featured by novelty. But what do I mean in terms of the consequences of this novelty? What creates the crisis? What are the unique challenges that crises provide to us, and that we have to deal with in the midst of these events? Well, first of all, as our first speaker mentioned, there is enormous uncertainty and very low situational awareness. We simply are not in touch with all of what is happening, and that uncertainty may be because this crisis is occurring in many places at the same time, or because it is in remote areas, or because it involves something like COVID that has, where there's great scientific uncertainty. And that means, by contrast with the more familiar crises, routine emergencies that we deal with on a regular basis, and where we know the contours of what those emergencies are like, we know what features of them to look for and to identify so that the responders have a good idea of what they're facing. The uncertainty of a crisis creates a great deal of difficulty in thinking about what we should do next, because we don't know what's going to happen. It is also the case that no one is an expert in these crisis situations on all of the aspects. There are people who have some form of expertise that's useful, but no single individual is likely to be the repository of expertise, or no group of individuals. And as with COVID, as an example of this, our infectious disease specialists have one set of skills, our epidemiologists have another, the people who work in hospitals have yet different ones, the public health system has skills that are appropriate, but emergency managers recognize many features of these situations that need their expertise. We need law enforcement. We may need experts. We need the ambulance corps to be able to bring sick individuals to get help. And so all of these things create a problem of, by contrast, say, with a fire in a commercial district, where the chief of the firefighters on the scene has the experience to understand most of the aspects of that situation and can be confidently in command of what's going on. In a crisis of the sort that I've been identifying, it requires us bringing together diverse experts, many of whom may not know each other ahead of time, and having them work together in figuring out what the problem is and what possible ways of responding and solving it. This, of course, creates a great deal of stress, and even among experienced responders, a good deal of fear. I've spoken with a number of people who have been confronting COVID, and that fear is not simply a fear of personal consequences, possibly contracting the disease, although that is in the background for many of them, but also the fear that they won't be able to perform well and do the things that they've trained for and believe is their function. And also fear for the many people who are affected by the emergency and who will suffer perhaps because the expertise of the professionals is insufficient to deal with the problem that those people affected are experiencing. All of this that I've mentioned before, the uncertainty, the lack of expertise, comprehensive expertise, the fear and stress creates a sense of lack of control. People simply don't feel on top of the situation in the way that emergency responders feel when they're confronting a routine emergency of a type that they've seen before. They recognize that in these crisis situations, their usual operational capacities are insufficient, that they need to muster skills and capabilities that go beyond what they normally are able to provide. And almost always, these kinds of situations go beyond the capabilities of a single organization. Again, the commercial fire that I mentioned before might be dealt with almost exclusively by a fire department with perhaps a little bit of backup from the police and emergency medical services, but the fire department is in control. It's the leader of this operation, and it has the skills to deal with it. By contrast, crises almost always require interorganizational collaboration, and sometimes, in fact, quite often, that interorganizational collaboration is very uncomfortable. Those organizations haven't worked together before. They have only the loosest sense of what the capabilities of their collaborators are. They may have different, somewhat different goal sets or different priorities, and meshing those organizations under crisis conditions can be extremely difficult. because this situation is something that's unprecedented in some fashion, either because it's brand new or because it is of an extraordinarily large scale, or because it's multiple emergencies on top of each other, our emergency response system is likely to lack a comprehensive plan. It doesn't have something to guide itself by. The plans that are on the shelf might have elements that are useful, but they have to be stitched together in brand new ways, and new elements have to be improvised in order to deal with the unanticipated elements of a crisis. That means that there's no checklist of standard operating procedures that we can execute simply. The kinds of things that again, say a fire department pulling up at the scene of a commercial fire knows about connecting hoses, rolling out to hydrants, rolling out the hoses, getting ladders set, positioning ambulances, etc. That kind of checklist of what they've done in the past, what they've been trained to do, doesn't exist for a crisis. And it may turn out that predetermined actions might be insufficient or even counterproductive. And so the kinds of things that we have gotten ready for routine emergencies, such as, say, in thinking about COVID for a flu epidemic, some of the things that we did that we have in place for dealing with a flu epidemic have not been sufficient to deal with COVID. And sometimes things that we do on an ordinary basis may be counterproductive. So during the SARS crisis, both in China, but also in Toronto, Canada, many of the infection control methods that were used in hospitals on an ordinary basis for pneumonia or flu, because of the extreme contagiousness of SARS, turned out to facilitate the transmission of SARS from one patient to another in hospitals. In Toronto, for example, well over half of all the cases of SARS that occurred in Toronto were contracted in the hospitals, either by healthcare professionals or by other patients, because the infection control systems that were perfectly satisfactory for pneumonia or flu or other routine infectious diseases turned out to facilitate the transmission of SARS, and therefore those practices were counterproductive. So in these kinds of situations, our goals and priorities, unlike in a routine emergency, may not be clear, and they need to be sorted out. And in the process of redefining goals, figuring out priorities, recognizing that we're going to have some failures in the earlier stages, all of this create the potential for either sharp disagreement or conflict. And we've seen this certainly in my home country, the United States, during the Trump administration and continuing into the Biden administration. India has experienced similar disagreement and conflict over policies adopted by the Modi administration. And these kinds of political conflicts often are the product of crises. So taken as a package, I think that what we see here is very different from at least the ideal version of the routine emergencies that I talked about before. And I've given some examples of these features as I've been talking, but I think that this sounds a lot like what we've experienced with COVID-19, and that these kinds of issues are not simply theoretical possibilities, but actually things that we've experienced, and not just in a single country, but in many of the countries that have had severe outbreaks of COVID-19. Infectious disease epidemics have some additional features that are sometimes quite different from other kinds of crises. Disease is invisible. It's a crisis that lasts over an extended time frame, typically. Even a typhoon or an earthquake may have an extended time frame of response. They both have long periods of recovery, but the actual response period may be relatively short, not a day, but perhaps just a couple of weeks. Whereas infectious disease outbreaks, as we've all lived through, can last for years, as ours has. There's a risk to the community at large. These crises extend over large geographic areas, and they threaten not just people who are in the immediate vicinity of an accident, a transportation accident or an explosion, or even a typhoon. They are geo-extensive and literally can be worldwide, as we tragically are experiencing. And that spread can be created by modern transportation. In the United States, it's pretty clear that the outbreak that occurred initially on our West Coast, particularly in Seattle, in Washington State and Southern California, almost certainly was the result of international travelers, most likely from China, and on the West Coast, the East Coast, in New York City in particular, but also in my hometown of Boston, by international travelers from Europe who were infected with COVID and brought it to the United States. As a result of these features, infectious disease cuts across boundaries, and potentially many jurisdictions are affected. And especially if we're speaking of emergent infectious disease, something like COVID or SARS or H1N1, that emergent infectious disease may bring with it a great deal of scientific uncertainty that means that we don't know how to deal with it in the initial stages, and sadly learn from negative experiences what sorts of things are not likely to work and what things are more likely to work. And finally, especially with emergent infectious disease, evolving knowledge makes it very, very difficult to establish the situational awareness that enables responders to be effective, the ability to know what's happening and therefore form plans of what to do with it. But it also makes it very hard to communicate credibly with the public. And we've seen over and over again political leaders during the COVID crisis being at least partially discredited. Not only political leaders, but even medical leaders being partially discredited by making predictions or trying to describe something that is evolving and changing, and therefore may invalidate some of the things that they have said and have led the public to believe will work in dealing with the COVID crisis. So what are some of the things that we have to think about? I've tried to, in dealing with the future, I've tried to give us a perspective, a conceptual perspective, both on the routine emergencies, which frame the vast majority of the things that our emergency management system deals with on a regular basis. Hard to put a number on that, but it certainly is something like 95 or 98% of what emergency response systems deal with. And being effectively ready for dealing with those routine emergencies is something that we should value, that we should strive to improve constantly, and that we can take a great deal of pride in. If one looks, for example, at the evolution of the fire service or law enforcement, not just in, say, a recent decade, but particularly over the course of the last century and a half or so, what we can see is the increasing professionalization of these functions, the increasing effectiveness of them, the application of knowledge, the application of advanced methods of training our people. And we see this in field after field that are related to emergency management, the increasing professionalism and increasing competence of those of those professional groups. It's nowhere near perfect, but I think we can take pride in how well that has happened. And many of you in the audience today have contributed to that development in your countries. And sometimes the steps are incremental and sometimes they're much larger, but we've seen, certainly seen enhancement. But how do we deal with crises, the kinds of looming events that can throw the world off its, even off its axis? It's certainly the axis of human enterprise, as COVID has done. And I think that we can see that by contrasting what we need to do in order to get prepared for routine emergencies on the one hand and crises on the other. So for routine emergencies, as I've tried to speak about, we have the development of contingency plans for different threats, the professionalization of our personnel, the development of procedures and practices that are standardized and therefore we can use for training purposes and that we can use as benchmarks for excellent performance. Our leaders typically for routine emergencies have been exercise their leadership both because they have authority, they've been appointed to leadership positions, but that appointment is most often based on their expertise and past performance. So we move people up in these professions, whether it's medical or firefighting or law enforcement or the military. We move people up typically because of their expertise and professionalism, and therefore their authority comes heavily from that expertise and professionalism. Of course, we know in the real world, some of those things are political, but even in many political appointments, there is a strong element of professionalization and expertise. It's becoming increasingly rare for pure political appointees with no competence to be appointed to these positions. As a result, in routine emergencies, it's most common for a hierarchical command structure to exist, and the authority of leaders allows them to exercise that command, and we aim for precision execution. It's not always precise, but we aim to constantly improve the ability to execute our responses to these kinds of emergencies. The pattern for crises, though, I think is quite different, and that's the justification for separating out this idea of crisis response from routine emergencies. Because in a crisis, we have limited scripts. Our plans may give us a little bit of help, but they have to be substantially adapted as the crisis develops, again, as we've experienced over and over again during COVID. We don't have well-developed skill sets. Nobody's an expert in how to deal with these, and nobody's a comprehensive expert, even though some kinds of expertise are certainly applicable. We have to improvise and invent. We can't simply look at our checklist of standard operating procedures and try to implement that. And that means that leadership is not going to be based purely on authority. It's not going to be based purely on past performance and the expertise that goes along with that. Successful leaders, especially the ones that emerge over time with an extended duration crisis, are going to be people who have the ability to cope with the unexpected, who are able to respond to things that weren't in the plan and be able to do that in an effective way. That's quite different from simply relying on past performance and expertise that comes from that. The result of that is that hierarchical command is sometimes counterproductive. And what we really need is a variable command structure. It has to be much more collaborative and a flatter command structure in order to gather information, to assess the kinds of ideas that are generated for dealing with something that we've never seen before or that surpasses our capacity, and somewhat a flat hierarchy for developing plans of what to do next. But then when we are trying to implement those plans, we need to be more directive for implementation. So think as an example of this, the effort in India and many other countries, including my own, for getting vaccinations out. In the early stages, when we were developing vaccinations, when we were trying to figure out how to mobilize the manufacturing capability that we needed to mass produce the vaccines, in thinking about what was the best way to get these out to the population. We needed a collaborative decision-making process to air possibilities, to assess them, and to reach decisions about how we should do all of these functions. But now that we're in a different stage, at least partially in a different stage of actually delivering these vaccines to very large populations, the enormous task that India faces with 1.4 billion people. At this stage, we need a more directive command structure to make sure that we're operating as quickly as possible, that we have a comprehensive geographic strategy for administering vaccines, that we're not leaving people out. And this implementation structure may be replicated at the national level, at the state level, at the municipal level. The result of all of these things that I've outlined for crises is that, by contrast with routine emergencies where we can aim for precision, we have to be somewhat more tolerant of faults. And it's a sad feature of being a political leader during a crisis that the public expects precise execution, but that there is going to be a much larger trial and error method in dealing with an unanticipated crisis and a crisis that's never been experienced before. The error part of trial and error tends to get magnified politically in ways that are perhaps unfair to our leaders, sometimes justified as well. So I've outlined what I think is necessary for leadership in a crisis situation. In the 21st century, I think we have to face the fact, as our introductory speaker made the point quite effectively, that major disasters are becoming more frequent. They tend to be more intense, and they're thus a greater threat to our lives and livelihood, not simply in limited geographic areas, but over wide stretches of our country and indeed of the world. Well, why is that the case? Is that simply being a Cassandra and or even Chicken Little and saying that the sky is falling? Or are there good reasons why these disasters are becoming more frequent, more intense, and a greater threat to humanity? One of them, of course, is that we have larger, more concentrated populations, and those people are often located in areas of substantial risk. People are settling in floodplains. We have coastal cities that historically have been centers of commerce and knowledge that are endangered by rising seas. We also have increasingly complex and interconnected human systems. 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago, an earthquake might occur in a rural area. Its impact might be horrific on the people who lived in that area, but it would be relatively easy to separate the impact, essentially not just to separate it, but the impact of a rural earthquake might have very little in the way of implications for what happens to people who live in other parts of the country or in cities. But in the 21st century, our systems are much more interconnected. One example that I think is very telling is about the Bangkok floods in 2010. As you may recall, there were very severe floods in Bangkok that spread over a very large area of the Bangkok metropolitan area. But some of the impacts of those floods might have been very unexpected. And indeed, those floods in Thailand had an effect on the ability of computer manufacturers in the United States, Japan, and China to actually carry out their business and supply computers. Well, why was that? It turned out that a very high concentration of disk drive production was in the Bangkok metropolitan area. And the result of that was that there was a worldwide shortage of disk drives, which meant that people who were trying to assemble computers and laptops could not fulfill the quotas that they had for production, and prices zoomed for computers, and the supply was much more limited. Certainly today, our dependence on the internet, on telecommunications, are quite vulnerable in many cases to natural disasters and other kinds of crises. Technology risks also enhance the danger of natural disasters. In Japan in 2011, the tsunami knocked out the electrical power system of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which led to the overheating and explosion of several of the reactors at that plant. So those risks certainly created that natural disaster, the tsunami, created incredible risks for a very large segment of Japan. And those technology risks independently can be quite severe, as those of you who live in India no doubt remember quite bitterly with the horrible Bhopal factory disaster. And equally important to all of these things, climate change, for a variety of reasons that we've been reading about in the newspaper and that were outlined for us earlier in this evening's presentations, climate change is likely to increase the frequency and intensity of these kinds of disasters. So in the 21st century, we need to be alert to the possibility that we will have a much larger number and perhaps a wider distribution of the kinds of crises that I've been outlining this evening. Just to give a more practical example, not to be so abstract, what is the climate change impact on hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones? Well, one thing is it creates much more intense winds that can cause storm surge, coastal flooding, increase the number of power outages, and increase property damage. It also brings more rain. Every single degree increase of warming allows the air to absorb 7% more water, and that means that rainfall can be much larger and more intense than it might have been in a previous hurricane. Climate change is slowing down these storms, and that means for any particular geographic area, any city, for example, it's going to increase the rate at which rain falls and the amount of rain that falls, and thereby flooding. In 2017 is just one example. In the city of Houston in southwest United States, Hurricane Harvey created flooding in over 70% of this very, very large spread out mega city in the United States. The storms that climate change will facilitate are likely to spread out into areas that have not historically experienced hurricanes, and they're going to be more volatile. Those storms are going to intensify more rapidly, and that means that we're going to have a lot less warning that a cyclone is approaching, and it means it's going to be much harder for us to warn areas that are vulnerable and where necessary, make it much harder to evacuate people. So all of these things illustrate, I think, some of the pressures that climate change is creating that will intensify this type of natural disaster and create new and tougher challenges for the emergency response system. Another feature that characterizes this era is that these kinds of crises take place in systems that are tightly coupled, as sociologists term it, that they have interconnected dimensions. And as a result, the failures in one part of the system can cascade through the system. As I mentioned earlier, the modern societies are increasingly vulnerable to these kinds of events. As one example, southern China in 2008 experienced a very uncharacteristic series of blizzards over a 2 or 3 week period that occurred in parts of China that rarely see blizzard conditions, and yet they saw one blizzard on top of another. And those blizzard conditions had these kinds of cascading impacts. First, it created problems of transport and shipping. Passenger rail travel was completely disrupted, as was highway travel. And this occurred, of course, this occurred during the Spring Festival time in China, when as many as 400 million Chinese get on the road and travel to their hometowns. It also disrupted freight traffic, which meant that various commodities could not move in China. The economic and social effects were tremendous. Motorists were stranded on snow-filled highways. Train riders were stuck either in stations or sometimes out on the route. Travel for Spring Festival was disrupted. This created social unrest over a period of several weeks. Factory production was reduced, and that meant that commodities were higher priced and inflation started to move through the economy. There was an effect on agriculture because the snows damaged crops and reduced the ability to harvest those crops. It also limited food distribution. The freight chain interruptions meant that coal could not be shipped around the country. The snow and ice collapsed power lines, and the result of that was that there were many blackouts, some of them in places that had very little snow, but some of them in blizzard conditions. And all of this created tremendous stress for government and politics in China, both for individual ministries, for Communist Party leaders, and also for the People's Liberation Army, which was called out to deal with the blizzard, having manpower and equipment that was useful for removing snow. So this kind of cascading impact, and we could construct a similar sort of flow chart for the way in which COVID has spread its impacts across the economies of many countries. These kinds of cascading impacts are part of what characterize crises. And it's one of the reasons that the interorganizational collaboration that I mentioned earlier becomes so necessary, because of these interconnected elements of the crisis. Let me quickly mention this. Increasingly, I think that we're seeing what you might call concurrent crises, or what we could also call complex combinations. In an era of pandemic disease, these kinds of things are becoming more important. So, for example, in the United States, in the West Coast, we've had some terrible forest fires this fall and summer, and it has created difficulties for the firefighters who number in the thousands, that even the tens of thousands who are fighting these many fires. In terms of the work culture and the way in which they're cared for and the facilities that they have, preventing COVID from spreading among the fire crews has been a huge challenge, an additional challenge to the large one of fighting these very large fires. areas that have had to evacuate because of hurricanes. The emergency sheltering problem has been much worse than it is normally. Maintaining social distancing, preventing the transmission of COVID has been a tremendous issue with these overlapping crises, the hurricane itself and the pandemic disease. And of course, something that we could spend an entire lecture on, but is also critical, is that these kinds of concurrent disasters or even individual crises are problematic for the most vulnerable members of our society, women, children, low-income families, people who are institutionalized or disabled, racial and ethnic and religious minorities, senior citizens, people who speak the non-dominant language and don't understand the dominant language, and perhaps for undocumented immigrants as well. All of these people are extra vulnerable to the threats of crises. So let me conclude then by outlining for us some of the challenges that crisis preparedness is posing in the years to come. I've tried to describe a situation where we have dynamic, evolving conditions that evolve frequently, issues that aren't clear-cut, the fact that our goals and priorities haven't been sorted out and are often a matter of contention politically, that the need for making decisions, unprecedented decisions, is constantly arising in real time, as we've seen in the COVID crisis. The fact that we can't depend on any single organization or person to have the expertise or experience necessary, and the fact that we may in fact need to take action for which skills and processes and resources are insufficient. And therefore we have to cope with that insufficiency even though we must take action. And the whole situation feels chaotic and frightening, even to experienced leaders. One way of thinking about this is that in a normal situation, a normal, say a severe routine emergency, we may have a challenge that at first seems to exceed our expertise, but over some period of time, our expertise and ability to cope with that challenge tends to increase, and we get closer and closer to being able to cope with the challenge. COVID-19 has, in fact, though, created a much greater challenge than we have faced in recent years, certainly on a worldwide basis, and our expertise for dealing with it has been lower than it often is. And therefore, it's taken us a longer period of time to approach the stage where our expertise and our capability of dealing with challenges, in fact, matching what COVID has dealt up to us. We're getting closer, fortunately, but we're not there yet. And I think that some of the crises that we're likely to face in the future, perhaps not on quite so great a scale, but perhaps even greater, will pose similar gaps between the challenge and the expertise we can deploy. I've mentioned several times that crises require collaboration. I think it's important to emphasize as well that this is not just the emergency management system. It's not just the people who are gathered, not so much in the room for this lecture, but who are gathered on YouTube for this lecture, who think of themselves as being part of or close observers of the emergency management systems. And as a result of this, the collaboration of agencies that are outside of our system means that many of these people will never have worked together before. And if we do have any kind of plan for coordinating among those agencies, it is likely that some of those plans, or maybe all of them, are simply paper plans that we've never exercised or never had to use, and therefore they are suspect in terms of how effective they're going to be. So one of our big challenges in looking at the future is to prepare for multi-agency situations through planning and exercises, not just exercises that bring together people from an individual governmental agency or even cross-agency for the emergency management sector, but actually bring people from quite disparate places together to establish working relationships so that when a crisis strikes, they're not exchanging name cards, they're not getting to know each other and trust each other and believe in each other's credibility. Instead, they have a working relationship that will enable them to take action much faster. Are we ready? I think that means that we have to think a little bit differently about the risks that we face. This is a way of thinking of the standard risk management paradigm that is used by organizations in the private sector that many government agencies use. Basically, it graphs frequency and consequences, and we try to identify risks represented by these little blue dots. We analyze and assess their likely consequences and therefore forecast what is likely to happen if these risks are realized. And then we take steps to manage the risks, to either prevent the risk from turning into an actual event, or we try to mitigate them, for example, by seismically reinforcing homes and other kinds of buildings against earthquake danger. We may transfer risks, particularly through insurance, or we may shrug our shoulders and say we have to accept these risks. There's nothing we can do about them, but we do want to recognize them and perhaps prepare for responding to them. So this is the standard risk management paradigm. But how do we incorporate the, and this risk management paradigm is incredibly useful. I don't want to derogate it in any way. That preparing for the kinds of risks that we can anticipate has really proved worthwhile. So for example, in many countries, preparation for flooding has reduced the threats to life and reduced property damage. Fire departments, particularly in cities, have adopted prevention strategies, smoke alarms, sprinkler systems, and in many places we've seen a reduction in fires from what existed 25, 50, and 75 years ago. And vaccination programs for childhood diseases or other diseases have had the effect of reducing mortality from diseases that took horrific tolls in years past. So all of these management of risk methods for the risks that we can anticipate pay important benefits, but it isn't enough. And I think that that's crucial to recognize, and is really my theme for the evening. So let's think of this risk management in a slightly different way. What happens if we think about the degree of uncertainty about how often these risks are likely to manifest, and uncertainty about how substantial the consequences are going to be? There's an area of risk management where we have low uncertainty about frequency. We have reasonable ability to predict the frequency of urban fires or from the past experience of the fire department, or we can predict to some degree the incidence of flooding or other things. And we can think of these as tractable risks. And these are the ones that the standard risk management paradigm that I described a minute ago can handle pretty well. We can think about what their consequences are likely to be and think of methods of responding to them. But that leaves us an area of risks where there is a lot of uncertainty about how frequently these things are going to occur, or whether they're going to occur at all, or whether we even know about whether they exist. As perhaps way out here is COVID, something that we really didn't, or an emergent infectious disease. And we also don't know what the consequences are. We think of SARS as a bad example of emergent infectious disease, but worldwide there were only 8,000 cases of SARS. Compare that to the 250 million cases of COVID-19. Much more uncertainty about consequences of that particular emergent infectious disease as opposed to the previous one. So these are what we might think of as intractable risks, and they're the ones that the standard risk management paradigm doesn't handle well, because it's very hard to prepare to estimate how often we're going to face them and what kind of consequences they're likely to have. This is the realm of crises that I've been talking about tonight. There's a framing of issues that we might face that has been associated with the former Defense Secretary of the United States, Donald Rumsfeld, whom some people, including myself, are not necessarily very fond of, but Rumsfeld advanced this framework and was ridiculed for it because it sounded so strange. He said we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. In justice to Rumsfeld and other people who have, he actually didn't originate this, framing. It is in fact a pretty important one. We have known knowns. We know that some of the dangers that we face from flu or from fires or from flooding, we know what those are, and we know roughly how much damage they can do, and what and we have an idea of what we should do in response. So these are the known knowns. We also have known unknowns. We can think of emergent infectious disease as a general category in this sense. We know that this is a possibility, but we don't know exactly what's going to emerge. We weren't able to predict COVID-19. So those are the known unknowns. And we also have unknown unknowns. What are the risks out there that we just don't have any idea exist, but which periodically show up and suddenly we have to deal with? And it is the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns that are most likely to generate crises of the sort that I've been speaking about tonight. I hope that I have made the case that we should think about crises in a different way than we think about other kinds of emergencies. But it's worth noting, I think, that we have a bias in the way that we tend to think about it, that emergency management agencies and the public and perhaps political leaders and to some extent academics think about this world of emergencies and crises. And that bias, I think, comes from our success in increasing our ability to deal with routine emergencies. So we do risk assessment for known dangers. We do contingency planning for identified risks. We do training and exercises that are based on scenarios or the plans that we've developed for those identified risks. And we do after action reports and make adjustments for lessons learned from past experience. All of these things are worthwhile, but they are worthwhile for getting ready for routine emergencies, the kind of emergencies that we can anticipate. So look at that: risk assessment for known dangers, planning for identified risks, training and exercises for the things that we have developed plans for, or where we can write scenarios, and lessons learned from the things that we've done in the past. None of those things talk about novelty. And if we skew our preparation only in the definition, in the direction of those things, as important as it is to do that, we're going to be omitting preparation for things that we haven't anticipated. So it's quite likely that society is under-preparing for the kinds of novel threats that I've been speaking about tonight, and we don't sufficiently appreciate that we have to operate differently in crisis situations, as I've indicated, and we might miss some of the things that make crises novel, as the Chinese in particular did with COVID, but as many countries, India and the United States not least, underestimating the nature of that crisis. And we may apply, therefore, the approaches that we would use for routine emergencies, which are likely to prove insufficient. So what are the things that we need to do? I think there are three approaches for dealing with emergency preparedness, both for routine emergencies and crises. We want to continuously improve the way that we get ready for routine emergencies. There's still plenty of room for improvement, and that improvement should be taking place incrementally or sometimes in dramatic ways all the time. And the second thing we might want to do is to look around the world and try to see crises or emergencies that are occurring in other places and recognize that we might have to deal with them in our own place, and therefore prepare for those kinds of emergencies, identify them, plan, and prepare for them. And finally, the area that I've emphasized tonight is preparing for novel challenges, training against out-of-the-box scenarios, developing plans that are based on our capabilities that we would need, and exercising with partner organizations at all levels of government. I have a longer list on my time is elapsing, so let me go through these quickly and then be open for questions about them later. As I've been arguing, we have to be ready for new threats that take place in larger areas and that are either brand new or more intense and larger. We have to broaden the scope of preparedness by getting agencies that don't think of themselves as emergency responders involved. And we also have to get the private sector involved in using their assets of people and equipment and facilities to deal with emergencies. We want to strengthen institutions and partnerships in a number of different ways. The particular challenges that are posed by public health require at the national level, and really for countries like the United States or India that have federal systems, we need to strengthen domestic capabilities for public health and healthcare, not just at the national level, but down through our states or provinces and city level by doing a variety of things like investing in public health infrastructure, integrating public health with emergency management, improving our ability to collect accurate data and analyze it, building larger stockpiles of health and hospital equipment, improving our communication methods and systems, figuring out how to more easily draw on retired healthcare and public health professionals when a big crisis emerges, and worrying about the exhaustion and PTSD that healthcare workers may experience if they have to deal with horrible situations like COVID over a very extended period of time. There's drastic need for strengthening international institutions and collaborating. The United States, I think, particularly during the Trump administration, but lingering into the Biden administration, has been retrograde in this regard. In our temporary disaffiliation from the World Health Organization, but during the Trump administration being symbolically the worst manifestation of that. But we need to find new ways of cooperating and building a strengthened world system, which means that countries have to be less jealous of their national prerogatives. We've seen, for example, vaccine nationalism that has occurred in a number number of countries that have successfully developed vaccines. And so there's huge areas for improvement in improving our international institutions. And we have to take advantage of the potential of technology. There have been some miraculous developments in vaccine development. The United States, China, Russia have done that. India has great might in manufacturing vaccines and great potential for developing vaccines. And all of this needs to be improved and supported publicly. And we also need to find ways that large countries will share their resources, share their knowledge, and make sure that smaller countries, in fact, are able to tap into that that expertise and that technology in ways that those countries can afford. The financial is perhaps almost as important as the technological. So I've taken a long time, and I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for the questions and comments and disagreements that perhaps will come up during our discussion period.
Thank you so much, Professor Arnold, for such a wonderful, insightful, and splendid lecture. I think you touched, every aspect of routine, emergencies, and crisis, and how should we deal with it. So thank you indeed. May I now request Dr. Nivedita Haran to please share her insights. Dr. Nivedita Haran has been the former Additional Chief Secretary of Kerala, who brought together country's first state disaster management authority in Kerala after the implementation of Disaster Management Act of 2005. Over to you, Dr. Haran.
Thank you, Gaurika. Thank you, Professor Howitt. You have given us such a lucid lecture, which is so full of information and data and suggestions that I think it's going to make a lot of heads thinking, and probably a lot of papers and a lot of research could emerge from it. I don't need to go into it. I think all of you have heard Professor Howitt's lecture. I will just highlight a few points and probably try to place it vis-a-vis India with my background. It's true that the challenges of leadership that has emerged post-COVID has really drawn attention to the need for being better prepared, having better strategies, being able to collaborate better, and maybe strengthening our institutions. And as Professor Howitt rightly said, that these will be more and more, the crises will be more and more in the future. And therefore it is better to be, and it's cleverer to be better prepared than to face it and have problems. As you know, in India, we thought that we had things under control in the initial period. We thought we were doing very well. We had the lockdown and we thought we had got things under good control. But then the second wave really hit us. And we realized that there were a lot of gaps in our management within the health system, shortage of health facilities, shortage of equipments in the health provided in the health facilities. And even before that, we had this major crisis where we had the migrant labor traveling from one end of the country to the other. And that often escapes our attention, but that was a major crisis. And that really affected a large number of families within the country. And coming from Kerala, we actually faced that problem. And we saw how the laborers who were, the migrant laborers, the migrant workers who were working perhaps sometimes up to 4,000 kilometers away from home, then started to migrate back to their home states. And that created a minor crisis in a situation of lockdown where there were no transportation services, there were no trains, no buses, no flights, and that really caught us in a surprise. However, some things went well. We have been able to, we believe, get things under some control. Our problem of what we call the dilemma of life versus livelihood, we have to some extent reached a kind of balance where we believe that life, of course, is the priority. Saving lives is the priority. However, there comes a point where livelihood also has to be thought about. So how long can a country and an economy and a society remain under lockdown? We were under lockdown for 54 days, and we saw how there were people who have a kind of hand-to-mouth existence, and they needed the jobs, they needed the income. So therefore, the kind of problems we faced in India was actually, I'm sure, is the kind of problem that every other country or many other countries in the world faced. Now, the peculiarity, as Professor Howitt rightly said, is that this was the pandemic crisis this time was so novel that it not only was big in size, it was also widespread. I don't think anybody in their right mind could ever have thought that a crisis of this nature would strike. And when we think of a crisis, we think of a crisis striking one part of the world, or one nation, or one country, one area, or one region. But this was something that struck the entire world globally, universally. And that, I think, was something unprecedented. In a way, and Professor mentioned about climate change being a kind of creeping crisis that is happening, that is probably catching up on us, and therefore the need to be well prepared. The standard risk management paradigm that he mentioned is extremely important, and probably it is the counterpart of the SOP we talk about so much, the standard operating procedures, in the case of a everyday routine crisis. But at the same time, it will be difficult to come up with a strategy whereby we are able to face a crisis of this kind of magnitude, or maybe even larger, unless we have our act in order. And for that, as he mentioned, we have to be continuously improving, continuously improvising, continuously innovating and finding newer solutions. And that can happen not just at the highest level, it will have to happen at the lowest level, at the panchayat level, as we call it, the local government level, and at every other level in between. We also need to be to ensure that our health system, our various other systems, and that includes improving the life, the quality of life of the people, has to be better. Because only when people are better off, they would probably be, hopefully, better able to face a crisis of this magnitude. And most important, what he mentioned was to strengthen our institutions. That's, I think, no gainsaying the fact that, and it's only when we have good, solid, robust institutions, whether it is the health system, the communication system, the IT systems, even our food supply systems, unless they are robust and good, I don't think they can face a challenge which is of this magnitude. In India, we were able to tackle it, but then we still have not got over the crisis, I think. We are waiting and watching. Hopefully, this is now going to taper off the impact of the pandemic. But at the same time, and I know the government is also thinking in these lines, and I think the NDMA advisor will be better equipped to speak on this. We still need to ensure that even after the pandemic has ended, it cannot go back to life as usual, life as before. There have to be some changes, some improvements, some tweaking in our lifestyle, in our way of thinking, in our administration, in our public health system, that has to come about to ensure that in future we are not caught on the wrong foot, as happened in the case of this pandemic. Also, I want to mention that we talk about the leadership, and I'm sure there are a lot of youngsters, students listening to us, to Professor's lecture today. The leadership has to come not only from the highest level, as I mentioned earlier, it has to come at every level. It has to come at the grassroots level, it has to come at the district, region, state level. Only when that happens, we will be able to face a crisis in a manner that will ensure that entire mankind does not get exterminated. Also, the need for improving and bringing in improvisation and creativity and innovativeness, innovative thinking in our education system is extremely important. I think that is, especially for a country like India, where we have a huge number of, a humongous number of, our demographic dividend makes us one of the youngest populations, percentage of younger population in the world. We have to make sure that our younger population, the youngsters are trained to think in an innovative manner, come up with solutions, think on their feet, so that when a crisis happens, whether it is a small crisis in the form of a small flood or an urban flooding, or a major crisis, they are able to contribute. Only when that happens, I think we would be able in the future to face a crisis of this magnitude. I have taken a lot of time. I was extremely, I was enthralled. I was listening to the Professor Havit's lecture with all my attention. And you've given us a lot of things to think about, Professor. And I'm sure in the future, in our group, we'll be talking a lot on these issues and probably come up with some ideas in which we could make a little change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Haran, for your insightful words of wisdom. With the permission of Honorable Chair, Professor Arnold and Dr. Haran, can we take some of the questions? We're running out of time, but can we take some of the questions?
Of course.
Sure. Yes.
All right. So let me, put before you the first question. Let us take the question by Dr. Durga Prasad Chetri. So his questions are to Professor Arnold. So the first question is, what types of leadership with coercive attribute like in China, or legitimate attribute like in USA or India is suitable for dealing with crisis like COVID? And the second question by him is, why leadership with coercive capacity has more successful in managing crisis?
I'm sorry, leadership like what?
Why leadership with coercive capacity has more success in managing crisis?
I think the first question is in some ways a very difficult one to answer, because universal attributes are not likely to be found. They're likely to be at least partially contextually and situationally determined. So there has to be a fit between the leader's capabilities and the kinds of situations that that their profession is likely to face. But I would emphasize leaders who are oriented towards being collaborative, who are willing and often inclined to look outside of their own organizations as well as inside their organizations for ideas. Leaders who are not bound by the plans and standard operating procedures that they have been trained and experienced in dealing with, who recognize that they may have to improvise and are willing to take the risks of improvisation. Because of course, if you are confronted by a dangerous situation and you do what your plan said, even if it's inappropriate, then in the aftermath, when accountability is being sought, you can say, I did what the plan said, it didn't work, but I did what I was supposed to do. On the other hand, if you improvise and try to figure out what is suited to the circumstances that I'm actually facing and deviate from the plan, if things don't go well, or even if they do go well, you may be criticized for not following the plan, and you may be risking your career by having done what was appropriate to do in the circumstances of that situation. So I think that leaders have to be flexible, adaptive, resilient. They can't be located in the way that conventional leaders would operate. I think the second question was about how leaders in unitary or authoritarian systems might work as opposed to more flexible, more democratic systems. Is that the question?
Yes, Professor.
Then there's no question, I think, that in democratic systems where criticism and contention are permitted and in fact encouraged, that that crisis response, which often has to be quick and authoritative, has an advantage in responding to crisis. Democratic systems are, by their nature, designed not to respond to things quickly. They have checks and balances that make it possible for people to respond, make it impossible for people to respond immediately by command. I think in the longer run, when you're confronting a large-scale crisis, the democratic systems are likely to have a great deal of resilience, but I think their advantages of democratic systems are not displayed in crises as compared to other kinds of situations.
So the second question is by Sakshi Kundu from Miranda House, University of Delhi. She's asking, where do you see the focus of crisis leadership? On mitigation of crisis or adapting to the crisis, which some people call living in the new normal? Do you feel that the world leaders or even leaders at local level are ready or even interested in mitigating and preventing these crisis situations? Will they be able to overcome their obsession with issues like increasing production, trade and security issues, armament, etc.? What kind of tools do you think will be needed for such crisis leadership?
Those are both good questions. I think that that leadership needs to focus both on preparation and on mitigation and response. Mitigation actually has two dimensions to it, one before an emergency event and one after. It might involve, one could think of things like seismic reinforcement of housing units as a form of mitigation for earthquakes in advance, whereas you can also have a number of measures that are trying post-earthquake that would try to mitigate the damage that's being done. Perhaps these are for different kinds of leaders, and indeed the mitigation measure that I mentioned before the crisis for seismic reinforcement is likely not to be the province of emergency managers, but much more likely to be the province for development people and housing professionals, which is one of the reasons why we need the cooperation of emergency managers, the collaboration of emergency managers and these other kinds of managers. I think I'm sorry, I've forgotten what the second question was.
Just a second. Give me a second. What kind of tools do you think will be needed for such crisis leadership?
I think that it's unlikely that we're going to find rules that are going to work. One of the things that characterizes crises, which was involved in the longer version of the question that you asked initially, was the fact that we simply don't know what the goals and priorities are going to be in a crisis. I think that certainly in the United States, I can't speak for India, my knowledge is not strong enough, or for other countries. In the United States, I don't think anyone would have predicted that the COVID crisis would first of all have I think the one predictable conflict that might have been predicted would have been one that Dr. Haran cited, which is the conflict between economic conditions and dealing with the health crisis. That is perhaps predictable for an extended health crisis. But I don't think that we anticipated, for example, the difficulties that would be involved in education, having children out of school for extended periods, having children having to take their classes online. And we didn't think about the lack of computer facilities for many families. We didn't think very hard about the fact that younger children were simply not well suited to spend all that time online as compared, say, to university students or high school students. And the conflict between taking measures like sheltering in place for health reasons versus education was simply something that we hadn't thought of ahead of time. In the United States, we've also had a conflict between people who believe that it's their personal right to not wear masks or not get vaccinated, and they pose it as a civil liberties and freedom issue versus the public health dimensions of the crisis. And so if we can't anticipate the kinds of value conflicts that are likely to arise, we're not likely to be able to devise very good rules in advance for how to govern decision-making under those circumstances. And I think that's why the crisis response is almost inevitably a messy process, because people are having to think through and deal with conflicting priorities or conflicting goals that different people could reasonably place one above the other, and a different person might place a different one above the others. Therefore, I think that these are things that are very hard to work out in advance in a rule-based way.
We'll be able to take the last question. So this question is by Himanshu Shekhar Mishra from NDTV. He says, to put in place an institutional mechanism to facilitate international collaboration to combat such a pandemic in future, what kind of international protocols would be required? Should UN or WHO take the lead? Second question is, United States is one of the few countries which has a law which specifies the quantum of compensation to disaster victims. But we saw hundreds of millions of people become food insecure and pushed back into poverty during the pandemic in India and many other countries. What kind of compensation mechanism would be needed in a country like India?
Let me take the second question first, where I don't think I have a very good answer. I think it would be very presumptuous of me to propose something for India when I am very, very far from being an expert on Indian government and society. I think there's a universal need in a crisis like COVID to make sure that we are not ignoring people who are affected in the ways that many poor people have been affected. And we have to worry about other vulnerable populations, women and elderly people, migrant laborers, etc., who are also greatly disadvantaged by comparison with middle-income people who have many more resources for withstanding a crisis like COVID. But exactly what the mechanisms ought to be is something that I simply can't comment on, especially for India. In answer to the first question about international organization, I think this probably should proceed on multiple fronts. Number one, I think, is that we need to strengthen the World Health Organization, make sure that it is highly professional, and that we don't have, for example, in the Ebola crisis in Africa several years ago, what we realized were that the WHO had a higher degree of politicization in the regional office in Africa, and that that hindered the response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. So we need to make sure that the WHO is both highly professional and has the resources it needs in order to coordinate and prepare for the kinds of a similar crisis to COVID, but one which we can't really anticipate the nature of. The part of that preparation by the World Health Organization is really going to be to work in tandem with larger countries that have the scientific and manufacturing resources to be able to quickly respond to an unanticipated health crisis. And I think some of that is going to be in the form of bilateral or limited multilateral collaboration rather than being carried out in the full forum of the 200 nations that belong to the United Nations. I think I used terminology working in tandem with the World Health Organization. I think that's important, but I think it's not going to necessarily be controlled by the World Health Organization. And those bilateral and limited multilateral negotiations, I think collaborations will be a healthy thing for getting the world prepared more quickly for these kinds of emergencies. It's also very important for us, for the world, to figure out a way of integrating the private sector appropriately. And we have to rethink the mobilization of production capacity for things like vaccines and other medical supplies. We have to rethink some of the intellectual property issues that are raised by the patenting of things like the vaccine and other resources. And we have to worry about being able to make collaborations like the COVAX system, which was supposed to relatively quickly be able to acquire vaccines and distribute them to the developing world, but which has not been able to do so. We have to figure out why that didn't work as well as it could have, and take steps to make future arrangements of that sort more effective.
Thank you, Professor Arnold. May I request our Honorable Chair, Shri Kunal Satyarthi ji, for his closing remarks now.
Thank you so much, Nivarika. I think this is one of the most wonderful talks I have heard on this topic, because I was wondering about what could be this topic about, and I'm short of words in expressing my deep felt thanks to and gratitude to Professor Arnold for taking out time and speaking on this topic. This has been really enlightening for me personally, and I believe it is same for all the other participants. I have in fact personally noted down a lot of good points about crisis leadership, and I think this is a very evolving concept, and the way you talked about regular emergencies vis-a-vis crisis, that has been a great learning experience. Those core slides on how do you differentiate a regular emergency and the graphical representation, and what crisis is all about, and capturing them in the bullet points about how it is different from a regular emergency is very important for everybody to understand. And particularly the uncertainty and the scale and the interdepartmental coordination is something that was very interesting, because those are very important, because people who have not met each other and people who do not work together in such situation will have to work together. So a lot of challenges, and personally for me and the organizer, I think this has become very clear that crisis management is characteristically a very different phenomena from regular emergency management. And this is going to be the call of the year and call of the decades to come. And we should be prepared for this phenomenon. So thanks, Professor, for the great, I was glued to this. I moved locations, but I was listening to this all the time. And I've taken personal notes, and I've also taken out points that I'll be using in my profession. And thanks to Dr. Nivedita ma'am. It's good to meet you online and hear from you. The long experience that you have. I'm a novice in this field, but I'm more grounded. So I look forward to more thoughts on this, and building upon this whole phenomena of going into a zone which has been in the disaster. We love things like guidelines and action plans and standard operating procedures. Is like going in the dark and trying to find out where the way is not laid down. So we don't have SOPs, we don't have guidelines, and we still have to move on. And the whole complexity of social things and economic things coming into the picture, and particularly the multiple crises happening again in the same hospital. I was having a long discussion about hospital fires in India, and we had data about all the hospital fires. And somehow all the hospital fires, most of them happened during those times when COVID patients were admitted. So multiple crises could be of different phenomena, and very difficult to get into this domain. But good that we have set the ball rolling and we have started thinking on this phenomena. So thanks to Amita ma'am, thanks to the organizers, thank you, Garika. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kunal sir, for your insightful words of wisdom. May I now invite Professor Amita Singh, President, NAPSIPAG Disaster Research Group, for the vote of thanks. Professor Singh, you are on mute.
I think this lecture has been really one of the ice-breaking phenomena in this research. And as Kunalji has said, this is going to set the ball rolling. And thanks so much, Professor Arnold Harvett, that you have once again, woken us up from a lot of things that we were doing, and we will have to undo now and revisit and think on a different platform. The kind of knowledge that you've spread before us today with your research and with your experience of intercultural, especially China, that, we are just thinking that where we could really put the first stone into the foundation. And this is one of the best panel that I could think of, that we have the national advisor, chief advisor with us. So most of your points are going to go straight into the crucible where they may turn out into policies. And, we are like a team of soldiers with NDMA who can just carry this forward. Nivedita ji is also with us, a seasoned and experienced administrator. So thanks a lot, Professor Arnold Harvett, and for steering forward all these new ideas. 2-3 things that are going to go straight into the disaster management discourse now onwards is, one, the gap between the challenges and the expertise. This has to be taken forward. The other, as Kunalji has said, that the one that routine and the emergencies, the natural and the man-made emergencies, the gap between them, the understanding, the preparedness, the rethinking on preparedness, before we come to the closing of the Sendai. I think this need to really be kick-started with a very strong speed. And the third is that, about the unknown, known and the unknown, that was one of the most beautiful part and summing down of your lecture, that sometimes we are actually hitting in the dark and we don't even know what we are doing. So we waste a lot of resources into an area where nothing really is understandable. So, some of these points need to be spread on the policymakers' table to revisit the whole idea of not just the pandemic, but all the other emergencies. I think if you prepare for one smaller one, the larger one will also be dealt with a stronger note. So thanks to the whole panel for being here, spending your time with us, and also enlightening NAPSIPAG. What you did something today, I need to share it with you. NAPSIPAG, Network of Asia Pacific Schools of Public Administration and Governance, and its specialized wing, Disaster Research Group, had been very scattered all this while during the COVID. You brought the whole team together, and you'll be surprised today. We have participants from Australia, coming from the Asia Pacific, from Australia to Philippines, to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Singapore, and then going to Mexico and to Canada and to Paris. So we have the South Asia classes full absolutely today, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, Maldives. So thanks very much for bringing the whole team together. Many of them, because we only planned for a short Zoom of 100 participants, and the rest could go on the Facebook and the live telecast on the YouTube. But we are overwhelmed with the kind of response that your lecture has driven across this Asia Pacific. In 2004, when NAPSIPAG came up with the ADB, the thought was that the Western groups are thinking very deeply into research, but the Asia Pacific is not benefiting out of that research. And so let's build a bridge in the knowledge gap. So the Asia Pacific policymakers could join together, build up their own knowledge, because their own knowledge is also very scattered, bring it up together, and then build a stronger bridge in collaboration with the West. And today, I think we have achieved it. We have arrived, because one of the top scholars in the West is now talking to us, and we are sharing knowledge so honestly with each other. And in times to come, I think this will only strengthen. So thank you very much. And I'm also thankful to all the participants who've spent time from across the world. Some of them, like Adrian Vickery, our very old friend from Australia, he said, it's very late at night, I have to go. So he still was there for the lecture. So, some of you have really worked hard being here together, and I hope we carry this forward. And to our whole team in India. In India, we have about 115 universities and institutions and colleges participating. And there is a representative from each of them today after a very, very long gap. So this is how you have brought us all together, the scholars, the learners, the researchers. And thank you very much wholeheartedly, generously to all of you for being here today, and hope to see you offline in our next meeting, which we are planning in February and March. And then at least we can wholeheartedly clap also, and the sound of clapping itself is a great elation. And I think next we are going to meet offline. And with this, we close down the 2021 annual lecture event of NAPSIPAG. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Srihan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am.
Can we, before we close down, can we please ask all the participants to please, switch on the video so that, we can take a screenshot of all the participants. Please, for a second, please switch on your video. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Amita ma'am, thank you so much. I'm from Bangladesh, Dr. Zebunisa.
Zebunisa, okay, very nice.
How are you, ma'am?
Let me add my thanks to all of you for being a wonderful audience, and for giving me the honor of being able to address you. I hope that someday I'll be able to attend one of your meetings in person and meet you all. It's been a great pleasure to be here today. And even though I'm sitting at my dining room table, I feel close to all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.